So imagine throwing the ultimate championship game.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
But the stadium, well, it literally burns to the ground. Both teams end up going home without the trophy.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and the score is exactly 0-0. But here's the crazy part. One side still throws a massive national parade to celebrate their quote-unquote absolute triumph.
Right, which makes no sense on paper.
Exactly. If you're looking for a clear-cut winner with, new borders and a tidy peace treaty, you definitely won't find it here. Welcome to today's deep dive, where we are jumping into the War of 1812.
It really is a wild one.
It is, because this is a conflict where the United States gained zero territory and the peace treaty at the end. It completely ignored the exact issues that started the fighting in the first place.
Yeah, it's a conflict that is just the absolute definition of muddy waters. I mean, we
Yeah.
are looking at a historical event that's been aptly described as the spectacular tie nobody needed.
The spectacular tie nobody needed. I love that.
Right. It's this really bold claim about a war that was built on, well, hubris, profound humiliation, sheer survival, and ultimately the total invention of a victory.
And that is our mission for you today. If you are the kind of learner who just loves that aha moment where a popular historical myth gets busted wide open, you are in the exact right place.
Oh, absolutely.
We're going to unpack how an indecisive, deeply embarrassing war somehow became remembered in the U.S. as this massive, triumphant Second War of Independence.
Which is quite the spin.
It's incredible spin. So to understand how this war ended in a spectacular tie, we first have to figure out why the U.S. decided to pick a fight with the world's greatest naval power to begin with.
Right, you have to look at the context.
So put yourself in the shoes of an American merchant in the early 1800s. You're just trying to sell like flour and timber to Europe, but you're caught between two warring giants, Britain and Napoleonic France.
Exactly. I mean, this war grew directly out of the enormous global struggle between those two massive empires. Both Britain and France were actively trying to strangle each other's economies. And American merchants, they were just caught in the middle, trying to keep doing business with both sides.
Just trying to make a living.
Yeah, but it was British policy that hurt American commerce much more visibly, simply because, well, the Royal Navy had an unmatched global reach.
Okay, let's unpack this. It sounds like getting sandwiched between two fighting giants in a bar, and one of them keeps stealing your wallet to pay his tab.
That's actually a pretty great way to look at it.
Yeah.
But it wasn't just a dispute over profit margins. It became deeply personal because of a practice called impressment.
Impressment.
Right. Impressment is what turned a frustrating trade dispute into this massive crisis of national sovereignty. The Royal Navy would literally stop American merchant ships out in the middle of the ocean, search them for deserters, and just force sailors into British service.
Wait, really? Just kidnapping them right off the deck?
Pretty much. But to understand the mechanics of this, you really have to look at the British perspective for a second.
Okay, fair enough.
Britain was fighting this existential war for survival against Napoleon, right? So to them, impressment wasn't random piracy. It was a desperately needed manpower system.
It just needed bodies on ships.
Exactly. They claimed they were merely recovering British subjects who were, trying to escape wartime service by sailing under the American flag.
But the reality on the deck of those ships had to be a lot messier, right? I mean, you're a British captain, you need a crew, and suddenly the guy with an American accent looks British enough.
Oh, much messier.
Yeah.
Yeah. British officers were seizing men who had uncertain papers, and very often they were taking clear-cut American citizens completely by mistake or, honestly, just out of convenience.
Wow.
And this totally boiled over in 1807 with the Chesapeake Leopard affair.
Right, I've heard of this one.
Yeah, so a British warship, the HMS Leopard, actually fired on an American frigate, the USS Chesapeake, killing and wounding Americans, literally just to remove 4 sailors.
That's insane.
It was a massive humiliation for this young republic. You can't just brush impressment off as a routine cost of doing business when foreign warships are openly firing on your national vessels.
Yeah, you can't exactly ignore that. So the oceans are this complete powder keg, but that anger on the water, it bleeds directly into the western frontier
I
too.
know, absolutely.
Because you have the Shawnee leader, Tecumseh, building this massive multinational indigenous confederacy to resist U.S. expansion. And the Americans at the time, they were absolutely convinced that the British up in Canada were kind of the puppet masters pulling Tecumseh's strings.
Which I should point out was a fundamental misunderstanding of indigenous agency.
Right, they weren't just taking orders.
Exactly. Tecumseh's alliance with Britain was highly strategic. He wasn't taking orders from British officials at all. He was fighting for the survival of his own people and their lands.
Yeah.
But for Americans looking up at Canada, they just saw leverage. They figured, hey, if we can take Canada, we remove British influence from our frontier, we stop the indigenous resistance, and maybe add some territory to the map while we're at it.
Okay, wait, I have to stop you there for a second.
Sure.
Because everything I learned in school kind of painted President James Madison as this, like, timid, deeply intellectual scholar who just got completely bullied into declaring war by that group of aggressive young congressmen, the War Hawks.
Right, the War Hawks.
Yeah. Are you saying that entire narrative is wrong?
It's a very persistent myth,
No.
for sure. But when you look at the letters and records from the time, a totally different reality emerges.
Really?
Yeah. Yes, War Hawks like Henry Clay of Kentucky and John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, they were loud. They pushed really hard to defend national honor and expand into Canada, but they did not control James Madison.
So he wasn't just this passive victim of peer pressure in Congress.
Not at all. Madison was the executive, and he made the choice. He had tried economic embargoes, he had tried trade restrictions, he had tried diplomacy, and by 1812, they had all failed.
He was out of options.
Exactly. Madison concluded that if the United States just kept submitting to British coercion, it would expose the entire republic as weak and illegitimate.
Wow, so the stakes were basically the survival of the Republic's reputation.
Exactly. His true failure wasn't that he got bullied. His true failure was choosing to go to war without matching his massive objectives to America's actual practical military capacity.
Oh, man, okay. Let's dig into that mismatch. Because Madison failing to build a real army leads directly into what has to be one of the most disastrous military invasion plans in history.
It's pretty painful to read about.
The U.S. launched an invasion of Canada that was built entirely on wishful thinking.
It really was. And to understand why the military was so unprepared, you have to remember that former President Thomas Jefferson believed standing armies destroyed republics.
Right, the whole fear of tyranny.
Exactly. He had a deep philosophical fear that a permanent military would lead to a dictatorship. So he drastically reduced the regular army.
So what was the plan then?
He banked everything on economic pressure, some coastal gunboats, and citizen soldiers, state militias.
Which sounds nice in theory.
It was a noble philosophical idea that failed miserably in practice, yet Jefferson famously, and I mean incredibly arrogantly, predicted that conquering Canada would be a, quote, mere matter of marching.
A mere matter of marching.
Can you believe that? He perfectly captured the American hubris of the time. They genuinely assumed that local Canadian settlers would just welcome them as liberators with open arms.
Oh, wow.
And they assumed that Britain was just too distracted by Napoleon to send reinforcements across the Atlantic.
But the reality was the exact opposite of a mere matter of marching. Here's where it gets really interesting for you listening. It's like organizing a fierce, highly motivated neighborhood watch to take over the next town. But the second you hit the county line, everyone just drops their weapons and says, oh, sorry, my jurisdiction ends here. And that literally happened.
Yeah, you're referring to the Battle of Queenston Heights in October 1812.
Exactly. New York militiamen just stood at the border and flat out refused to cross the river into Canada. They claimed their legal obligations ended at the national line.
I mean, it perfectly exposes the limits of a war plan that depended on fragmented commands and state militias who really just didn't want to be there.
Right.
And the logistics were an absolute nightmare. The roads were terrible. Supply contractors failed left and right, and there was no single operational plan.
And the British and their indigenous allies, they took full advantage of that incompetence right out of the gate, didn't they?
Oh, immediately.
Yeah.
Before the American commander in the upper Great Lakes even knew war had been declared, they captured Fort Mackinac.
Just scooped it right up. But the most staggering moment has to be what happened at Detroit in August of 1812. General William Hull surrenders an entire fortress, and he does it without a single shot being fired. I mean, how does a commanding general just hand over a fort?
This is where we see the absolute brilliance of the British commander Isaac Brock and the Shawnee leader Tecumseh.
Okay, tell me about it.
Because saying Detroit fell without a shot is technically true, but it totally ignores how they made it happen. Brock and Tecumseh essentially ran a masterclass in psychological operations.
Wait, they bluffed him?
Completely. They were leading a much smaller force, but they used brilliant maneuvers. They purposely let the Americans intercept terrifying, exaggerated messages about their troop numbers,
Oh, that's smart.
and they played directly on General Hull's worst fears. You see, Hull was isolated, his supply lines were cut, and he was terrified that if he actually fought, Tecumseh's forces would massacre the civilians who were sheltering inside the fort.
Wow, so he was paralyzed by fear.
Brock and Tecumseh basically convinced him that resistance meant total annihilation.
Yeah.
So he just yielded. It was a complete and utter humiliation for the United States.
The whole invasion was a disaster because the Americans assumed Canadians wanted to be American. They completely ignored the presence of fiercely loyal British subjects, regular troops, and Indigenous allies who absolutely did not want to be annexed.
Not even a little bit.
So, with the army totally humiliated on land, the American public desperately needed a win. And surprisingly, they actually found it on the water. But there's a massive difference here between the tactical victories the public cheered for and the strategic victories that actually kept the country alive, right?
Yes, the difference between tactical glory and strategic reality is so fascinating here. The United States Navy in 1812 was, well, it was tiny compared to the Royal Navy.
Like incredibly small.
Right. They couldn't control the ocean. But what they did have were a few very powerful frigates.
Let's explain what a frigate was in this era for you listening, because it's not just a standard boat.
Right, good point. So the Americans had these incredibly heavy frigates. These were ships that were faster than the massive British heavy battleships, but heavily armed enough to destroy standard British cruisers.
Okay.
They were basically the early 19th century equivalent of an armored fast attack vehicle.
And the guys commanding them weren't just amateurs. Men like Isaac Hull and Stephen Decatur, they were veterans of the Barbary Wars in the Mediterranean.
Yeah.
They knew how to fight far from home without needing to wait for orders.
Exactly. They understood independent decision-making, and they took ships like the USS Constitution and won these incredibly dramatic single-ship duels against British frigates like the Guerriere.
I can imagine the newspapers eating that up.
Oh, for the American public, these frigate victories were absolute dynamite for morale. They totally shattered the assumption that the British Navy was invincible.
But if we connect this to the bigger picture, what does winning a few glorious duels at sea actually mean for the war effort? Because, I mean, while everyone is cheering for the USS Constitution, American trade is tanking and the federal government is going broke.
And that right there is the strategic reality. Winning a one-on-one duel doesn't break a blockade. While the public celebrated these isolated victories, the Royal Navy was quietly and systematically concentrating its massive fleet all along the American coast.
Just boxing them in.
Yes, they instituted a crushing blockade. They literally parked their ships outside American ports and just waited.
Wow.
They trapped American warships, they shut down merchant trade, and as a result, they completely destroyed the federal tariff revenue that the U.S. desperately needed to fund the war. It was this slow, invisible strangulation of the American economy.
So if the famous ocean battles were really just tactical morale boosters, where were the actual naval victories that mattered?
They were on the inland lakes.
The lakes.
Yeah, Oliver Hazard Perry on Lake Erie in 1813 and Thomas MacDonough on Lake Champlain in 1814. You have to remember, in an era with terrible muddy roads, water was the only reliable way to move heavy cannons and supplies.
Oh, that makes sense.
Whoever controlled the lakes controlled the supply highways for the armies. Perry's victory on Lake Erie is what allowed the U.S. to recover Detroit and defeat the British in Tecumseh at the Battle of the Thames.
Okay.
And MacDonough's victory on Lake Champlain stopped a massive British invasion from Canada dead in its tracks. So the lake victories were the real lifelines that prevented a total collapse.
But that invisible strangulation on the coast was about to become very visible and very violent ashore. Because in 1814, the geopolitical tectonic plates completely shifted.
Oh, yeah.
Napoleon abdicates in Europe. The global emergency for Britain is suddenly over. And the British military machine is like this fire hose that had been spraying all over Europe, suddenly being focused entirely onto the American coastline.
The war became infinitely more dangerous for the United States practically overnight.
Right.
In August 1814, a veteran British force lands in the Chesapeake. They rout a totally disorganized American defense at Bladensburg, and they just march right into the dangerously exposed capital, Washington, D.C.
And this brings us to one of the most famous events of the war, the burning of Washington. Now, we often picture this in popular culture as this cartoonishly evil act by the British, just setting things on fire because they were villains.
Right, like comic book bad guys.
Exactly. But they had an actual strategic reason for setting the White House and the Capitol on fire, didn't they?
They did. It wasn't just senseless destruction. The British specifically targeted public buildings, the Capitol, the President's house, the Treasury.
Okay.
Part of this was direct retaliation. The year prior, in 1813, American forces had captured York, which was the capital of Upper Canada, and they burned and looted public property there.
Ah, so it was payback.
Definitely payback.
Yeah.
But beyond retaliation, burning Washington was highly calculated psychological warfare. It was designed to systematically humiliate James Madison's government and prove to the American people that their leaders couldn't even protect their own capital.
There's a detail from this night that sounds, honestly, like a movie script. The British officers arrived at the president's house. They found a dinner completely prepared with food and wine just sitting on the table. They sat down, ate the president's dinner, and then burned the house down.
That is substantially true. Yeah, it perfectly captures the suddenness of the American evacuation and the complete collapse of the Capitol's defense.
That's just wild. Now, Dolly Madison's evacuation from that burning house has become the stuff of legend, but the popular image of her running out with the famous portrait of George Washington, it hides a much more complex reality about who is actually doing the rescuing.
Right, and it's an important distinction to make. Dolly Madison's courage was very real, and she did refuse to leave until vital state papers were secured. She did order that the Gilbert Stuart portrait of Washington be saved.
Right, but she didn't just tuck it under her arm.
No, she didn't physically carry it out herself. The physical labor of removing that massive frame and saving the canvas was actually performed by enslaved and free workers,
Wow.
including a man named Paul Jennings, who later wrote a very detailed memoir of the whole event. It's a moment where preserving what is true requires giving accurate credit to the people who actually perform the work.
That is such an important point. And it's wild to think that the British might have just kept burning the whole city if a massive, literal storm hadn't struck Washington and put the fires out.
Yeah, a literal hurricane-force storm.
Crazy. But they withdraw, and they immediately set their sights on a much bigger, much more strategic prize, which is Baltimore.
And this is where the momentum completely shifts. Because unlike Washington, Baltimore was heavily defended. The citizens had built massive earthworks.
They were ready.
They were. The British advance by land is checked at North Point, and then their fleet tries to bombard Fort McHenry from the water to force their way into the harbor.
Which gives us the national anthem. And there's so much myth around this, too.
Yeah.
We kind of picture Francis Scott Key as this super patriotic guy who wrote the song while cheering on the fort's brave defense.
Right, but the reality is much more complicated. Key was actually a lawyer who opposed the war. He was a vocal war critic.
Really? I had no idea.
Yeah, he had gone out to the British fleet under a flag of truce just to negotiate the release of a prisoner. And the British wouldn't let him leave until the attack was over because he knew their positions.
Oh, so he was essentially stuck there.
Yes. So he is forced to watch this grueling 25-hour naval bombardment.
And the fort just refuses to fall.
It holds. He sees the massive American flag at dawn, realizing the fort survived, and he writes the lyrics to what he originally called Defense of Fort McHenry.
Okay, but the tune he used, this is my favorite part.
Oh yeah, he didn't invent the tune. He already had it in his head. It was a song called To Anacreon in Heaven, which was literally a drinking song from a gentleman's music club in London.
Wait, the anthem tune is a British drinking song.
It absolutely is.
You cannot make that up. Our national anthem is set to a British drinking tune. But beyond the birth of a song, Baltimore's survival was a massive turning point for the nation.
Absolutely. Paired with McDonough's naval victory on Lake Champlain, Baltimore proved the U.S. wasn't going to just collapse under British pressure. It erased some of that deep humiliation of Washington and significantly improved America's bargaining position across the ocean in Belgium, where peace negotiations were already underway.
Right, which brings us to the peace table in the city of Ghent. On December 24, 1814, American and British commissioners sign a treaty. And when you read the terms of this treaty, it is literally a giant reset button.
Yeah, the Latin term they use is status quo antebellum, basically, a return to the conditions that existed before the war.
Like nothing happened.
Exactly. Neither government could force the other to concede, so they just agreed to stop fighting. No territory changed hands. The U.S. didn't get Canada. Britain didn't take any American land.
Okay, but what about impressment? You know, the kidnapping of sailors that started the whole thing?
It wasn't even mentioned in the treaty text.
Not even that.
Nope. Britain only stopped impressing sailors because Napoleon was defeated, so their emergency demand for manpower vanished. The whole maritime dispute just faded away on its own.
So on paper, it's a dead heat. It's a tie. But then weeks after the treaty is signed, we get the most famous and probably most misunderstood battle of the entire war.
Right.
The Battle of New Orleans on January 8, 1815.
This is where the speed of communication or lack thereof completely changes history.
Right, because there's no internet.
Exactly. The treaty was signed in Europe, but it took weeks for ships to cross the Atlantic. The news simply hadn't reached the armies operating in the Gulf of Mexico.
So General Andrew Jackson is defending New Orleans.
Yep.
And his force is unbelievable. It's not just regular army guys.
No, it's a mix of everyone.
You've got Tennessee and Kentucky militias, French-speaking Louisiana Creoles, Baratarian privateers, literal pirates,
They're pirates.
and a contingent of Choctaw warriors, and crucially, over 900 black troops and volunteers, both free and enslaved, who built the defenses and fought in the line.
It was an incredibly diverse, improvised force, and Jackson brilliantly anchored them between the Mississippi River and an impassable cypress swamp, which essentially forced the British to attack straight across an open sugarcane field.
Ouch. That sounds like a trap.
It was, and it was a staggering slaughter. The British launched a massive frontal assault of about 5,300 veteran troops, and the American artillery and infantry just decimated them.
Wow.
There were over 2,000 British casualties, compared to incredibly minimal losses for Jackson's men.
But wait, if the peace treaty was already signed in Belgium weeks before this battle even happened, doesn't that mean the Battle of New Orleans was completely pointless? Like, the war was already over?
Well, legally, the treaty still had to be ratified by the U.S. Senate. But practically speaking, yes, the battle didn't change a single comma in the Treaty of Ghent.
Right.
But psychologically, it changed everything.
How so?
Because of the timing of the news cycle. The American public heard the news of Jackson's miraculous victory at New Orleans, and almost immediately after, they heard the news that a peace treaty had been signed.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, in the public mind, those two events became locked together through cause and effect. It created this powerful, unshakable illusion that Andrew Jackson's stunning victory forced the British to surrender and agree to peace.
That is wild. It allowed a war that ended in a dead heat to feel like a spectacular triumph.
Exactly.
Though I feel like it's worth noting a really dark postscript to Jackson's victory. He kept New Orleans under strict martial law long after the British left, and he even arrested a judge and journalists who challenged his authority. It really shows how quickly wartime necessity can turn into personal rule.
Yeah, it's a vital warning. The hero of the battle demonstrated just how fragile civil liberties become when military authority refuses to step down.
So looking back at our mission for today, the War of 1812 was a conflict where the map didn't change by a single inch. The causes of the war, like impressment, just evaporated on their own. The nation's capital was literally burned to the ground.
Right.
And yet, because Baltimore held on, and because Jackson won a massive battle right at the buzzer after the peace was signed, the United States spun the entire thing into a glorious Second War of Independence.
It's all about the spin.
The U.S. survived. Canada successfully defended itself and forged its own national identity. But if it was a tie for them, was there anyone who actually lost this war?
Yes. There was one clear, undeniable loser in the War of 1812, the indigenous nations.
Wow, yeah.
While the United States and Britain shook hands, patted themselves on the back, and went back to the old borders, the indigenous confederacy was permanently shattered.
That is heartbreaking.
They lost Tecumseh, their visionary leader at the Battle of the Thames, and even more devastating, they lost their military alliance with the British, who simply abandoned them at the peace table in Ghent.
Just left them out.
Completely. Without that British backing, they lost their most vital leverage to resist American expansion. For the indigenous nations, it wasn't a tie. It was a severe, lasting, and catastrophic defeat that cleared the way for the forced removals of the coming decades.
And that completely reframes the whole picture. It's an incredible journey you've guided us through today.
It's a heavy history, but so important to understand.
So think back to that historical scoreboard we talked about at the very beginning, that stadium burning down while one team throws a parade.
Right, the spectacular tie.
Exactly. The War of 1812 proves that sometimes the actual facts on a map, the terms of a treaty, or the reality of a burning capital, they matter far less than the story a nation decides to tell itself about a victory.
Absolutely true.
It makes you wonder, What other spectacular ties in history or even in your own life have been completely rewritten into spectacular wins just by changing the narrative? Keep questioning those scoreboards, and we will catch you on the next Deep Dive.